and begin recording this session. And we are live in today's webinar session with David Clutterbuck on the perils of team coaching. So everyone, my name is Christopher Lowe, and I am representing the Team Coaching Zone today for this webinar. I'm also joined by my colleague Angela Wright, who is representing ATD, the Association for Talent Development in New York. And along with the ICF, the International Coaching Federation chapter of New York City, we are really excited to have joining us today a really renowned figure in the coaching and mentoring world, David Clutterbuck, to be sharing some thoughts about team coaching today and some of his thinking on this. Just before we get into that, though, just want to say a few words and also invite my colleague Angela from ATD to share a few words as well, and then we'll give more formal introduction to David. And I'm going to invite all of you, if you are logging in just now, to try to manage your mute button on so we don't get background noise. So again, everyone, welcome. My name is Christopher Lowe. I am founder of Team Coaching Zone, and we're really excited to be organizing these webinars periodically to really bring great learning events to those who are, working with teams and organizations and coaching teams. And today we're really excited to have a really distinguished guest joining us. I'm going to mute for a moment, so we're getting some feedback. Okay. And so again, putting on these events, really excited to be bringing some of the best thinking, the thought leaders in the field of team coaching, and having David Clutterbuck joining us today is a real special treat. So again, this session is being hosted by Team Coaching Zone, ATD New York, and the ICF chapter of New York City. Angela, I'm going to invite you to come on and unmute and say a few words about ATD. And then what I'd like to do is give a more formal introduction to David, and then we'll pass over the mic to him so we can really get into some learning today.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted, Krista, to be collaborating with you on these events. I just wanted to say a couple of words. First of all, welcome to all of the ATD New York City members who've joined the webinar today, along with our partner for this event, the New York chapter of ICF. Thanks also to any USCMA friends and colleagues who may be joining from Australia. It's the crack of dawn there, so that's pretty committed and impressive. ATD have some great events coming up, including our next coaching webinar, which is on becoming a systemic coach with my colleague, Dr. Paul Lawrence. So look out for that. It's on 11 April. Now, I've been following David's work, and in fact, David, around the world for the last 10 years. It goes without saying that I think he's brilliant, but what I really love are his humor and his capacity to tell it how it is. So with that, over to you, Krista and David, and no pressure at all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angela. Well, great to be co-hosting this with you. We had a really wonderful, more than 300 people registered for this. Many people also interested in observing the recording who can't attend the live session. So I just want to let you all know that we have somebody sharing their screen here and may want to remove that. Mimi McGrath, I think you may be accidentally sharing your screen. David will be sharing his screen in a moment, so we'll get that taken care of. But let me give you an opportunity, everyone, to get to know David a little bit more. And so I'm really honored to introduce a distinguished guest. We have David Clutterbuck today. He's the practice lead for David Clutterbuck Partnership and Coaching Mentoring International. David is a really prolific writer. He's published more than 70 books, which is just jaw-dropping. He has a number of roles. He's a visiting professor at Oxford Brookes University, at Sheffield Hallam University, and at York St. John. He is the co-founder of the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, where he serves as International Special Ambassador. The list goes on and on. One of the things about David, he specializes in asking BDQs, bloody difficult questions. So that's something that David specializes in. He's a bit of a comedian, an entertainer, really fun guy. I had the privilege of doing an interview with him on my podcast, The Team Coaching Zone, a year or two ago. I think it's really great, listening. For folks may want to listen to that. And I've also had the honor of working with David on editing a forthcoming handbook, Practitioner's Handbook of Team Coaching, where we've assembled some really great minds on the topic of team coaching and publishing in that area. So really super excited to have you joining us, David, and sharing with us your model of the perils of team coaching around team performance, but also team dysfunction. Everyone, we're going to really invite you to use the chat window liberally, ask questions. We'll stop David from time to time to field some questions there. We've reserved about 15 minutes at the end for more interaction, so feel free to, ask questions now, save them to the end. We'll try to get in as much interaction as we can. And with that, David, I'm going to invite you to share your screen and to take it over. And let's enjoy an hour with David Clutterbuck.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can. I just unmuted you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks then, Krista. Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you in the evening here in the UK. Actually, I'm in the UK for a change. It's I find that that doesn't seem to be that common these days. So let me start by just going back to where I got really involved with teams and this whole process of the learning process that teams go through. And that was with a project funded by the European Union way back originally in 1998. And we did a study there of how teams manage their learning. And from that point, I've been following the literature, developing work, producing the book in 2008, Coaching the Team at Work, which I'm currently revising. And basically engaging with people all the way around the world, such as Krista and Angela, about how do we actually proselytize, if you like, good practice in team coaching. So I'm going to start by just looking at what we mean by team coaching, because it does seem to be rather variable in terms of people's definitions of it. Certainly, when I did an investigation over 10 years ago as to what actually people did when they said they did team coaching, we found an enormous variation, which went from team facilitation to coaching the individual members of a team, but not the team collectively, to team building, and things which I couldn't possibly see where the connection was with coaching or with teams existed at all. But increasingly, we're getting a body of knowledge now where we are getting a better collective understanding. And I think what we've seen now is a bifurcation, if you like, of two complementary ways of looking at the purpose of team coaching. And I've represented those in the slide here. And one of them, as you can see, it's a learning intervention designed to increase collective capability and performance of a group or team through application of the coaching principles of assisted reflection, analysis, and motivation for change. And that's very much a sort of the emphasis here is on performance of the group or team through learning, and then also on the building of capability of the team. So the outcome for team coaching is that you leave the team as you would leave an individual coachee with a greater capability to coach itself or themselves. The other definition takes more of a developmental concept to it. So enabling the team and also the individuals within it to develop. The focus of development tends to be on development itself rather than on success. So two, I think, complementary views of team coaching. And when we've talked to lots of team coaches about what they do, very often what we find is actually it's a mixture of both of these things. That if the individuals don't learn and grow, then the team coaching's impact will be much muted. On the other hand, if there isn't some focus of improvements, so they can't see what the outcomes of the coaching intervention, then again the team coaching tends not to be seen as worthwhile. So these two slightly contrasting but actually complementary definitions really I think helped me to put the whole thing into context, and I hope they'll be helpful for you too. So if we just look at this issue of performance, I think we've got some real problems, because actually we assume that we know what we mean by performance. But all of the literature that I've been able to explore and all the discussions we've had where we try to get underneath performance, it suggests that actually it's almost impossible to define, because it's always contextual. You can measure certain things. You can measure how many sales people make. But is sales today more important than the viability of the organization over a longer period, for example. So by what criterion are you measuring performance? Is it individual performance or collective performance? We know that in teams, you can have a lot of people who are individually performing extremely well, but collectively the team is a disaster. So who defines it? Is it defined by the team itself, collectively, by the individual members, or by its key stakeholders outside? Over what time period? Annual reports are a great way of obfuscating the realities of organizations. In some ways, the last thing you use to choose to invest money in a company would be its last annual report, because there's some implicit assumption that the success of last year is going to continue is not necessarily borne out by a reality. And perhaps one of the issues is, what's the purpose of the organization? A team can be highly successful, perform very well, but not contribute to the overall purpose of the organization. So all of these issues make performance actually a very difficult thing to define. And therefore, when we're working as team coaches, we have to be quite eclectic and elastic in how we help people think about performance. But if we assume that a team is high performing, and we create some criteria in order to define that, which a number of people have had, like this particular guy, Shampoo, who looked in depth at a variety of high-performing teams and did quite large literature search. So he came up with these 5 things. You need a lot of trust. Well, I think pretty much every study of high-performing teams has found that. A high level of respect as well. The common purpose, the willingness and ability to manage conflict. Sorry, there's 6 things here. The focus on results, an alignment of authority and accountability. I don't think anybody would argue with any of those things. The real issue is, are they all? Or put it another way, is that all? It's actually these cascades tend to be quite simplistic, in the sense that if we observe these in some high-performing teams, these must be the things that other teams, if they had them, would make them high-performing. We have no evidence that acquiring these things makes you a high-performing team, as opposed to actually these are just things that you would notice there are symptoms of being a high team. So cause and effect is not demonstrated in any of the research that we've seen. So I'm just as guilty, because I've done a study in one of the top 5 .coms, which I'm not allowed to name. But here we have lots of focus group interviews saying, well, okay, what actually goes on in the teams which you've designated as an organization as being the highest performing? And in this particular case, high performing related to delivers above average on targets or that have been set for them, has a high reputation amongst the management population and amongst its internal customers. And one other factor which I found really interesting, the proportion of people who want to actually join that team, who are queuing up to say, I'd like to join in with what you do. So if that's as good as we could get in terms of defining high performance, these are the things that we found in those teams. Hiring the right people. In some cases, they spent over 2 years interviewing people before they'd let somebody join the team, because they needed to know that they had somebody who was really going to deliver. They'd rather hold the position open. And one of the key interview questions is, would you want to spend 8 hours a day or more sitting opposite this person? I think it's a fascinating question. The way that they use success and failure. The recovery rate of teams in general, we have all sorts of horror stories, how long it takes a team to recover from setback. We're talking less than 24 hours for many of the teams we were looking at here. Now, part of this is because there's always something new and interesting to do. But there's a mentality here about the whole process of success and failure, and not being knocked back too hard by mistakes. In fact, using those mistakes as great learning opportunities. Instead of getting people to do a mixture of tasks, some of which they hate and some which they love, there was a lot of emphasis on as much as possible playing to people's strengths and the things that they did well and they had the energy for. So the energy of the team was focused. The respect thing, yes, we've seen that already. The trust and respect, we've seen those too. The attitude to change. do people regard change as a negative thing or actually as a great opportunity? And in these teams, the general attitude amongst staff was, wait, yeah, bring it on. The clear goals, yes, that's fairly obvious and consistent with all other studies in this area. But fizz and buzz. Fizz is the enjoyment that you get from the work that you do, and buzz is the enjoyment from the people around you. It seemed to be a major factor. And something called the secure leader, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. So putting all this into the context of coaching, if we just look at coaching generally, we can see coaching as something that links two conversations. There's the evolving internal world of an individual or a team, what's going on inside it, and the evolving external environment, so what's going on around them. And there's change happening in both of those. And if the team can link those things in conversations that enable them to understand both of them and understand how one can leverage the other, then that brings about much greater possibilities of improving performance, improving the environment, and continuous learning. And so if we want to see another definition of coaching or team coaching, we might see it in terms of these different contexts, linking these external and internal contexts, and the role of the team coach is to facilitate the team in its conversations to make that happen. So looking at the kind of models that we see, everybody I'm sure is familiar with Lencioni's model of the problems of the dysfunctions of teams. We've got some real problems with this and with all deficit models. It's rather like the problems that we see with some of the psychometric tests that are so popular amongst HR practitioners. There's a guy called I can't remember his name now, who was at Harvard, who took the view that virtually all of these psychometrics were designed on the basis of analysis of people who were sick, as opposed to people who were well. And what we see is the assumption in deficit models is one that you look for the dysfunctions of the team and you try and correct the dysfunctions. Now, anybody that's done any work in appreciative inquiry would say, no, you do exactly the opposite. You look for the positive things in the team. You try and get them to actually use those to get much more leverage. And really, what we're talking about here, it's not team function and team dysfunction. We're looking at in absolutes. We're looking at a spectrum of function and dysfunction. In Lencioni's model, for example, we can see that he points out to lack of trust, and that's what really needs trust. No, but the opposite extreme on a spectrum there would be gullibility. So the model tends to fall down a little bit there. The causation, there's a cascade there. If you lack one thing, then that leads to a breakdown in other things. Actually, it's not true. It's often much more cyclical. And the relationship between the five elements in Lencioni's model is much more complex than that. And of course, there's an assumption that everything that goes wrong or all the limitations of a team are things that relate to its internal processes, when actually teams are just like everybody else at the mercy of whatever's happening in the world around them. And if your market suddenly disappears, that is not necessarily something that can be directly correlated with any failures within the team of trust or accountability or being able to or motivation. So I think we have to be very careful when using deficit models, and we have to be very careful with using just performance models, because particularly the cause and effect issue is one that tends to trip us up. Now, if we look at the models that all of these models here, what we tend to see is that many of the models are designed specifically for teams and boards. Now, whether a board can ever be a team is a very big question, and I think a lot of people would say no, it can't, but simply by the fact that you are expected to exhibit collaborative independence in your thinking. But whether or not, how we resolve that particular argument, there are certain dynamics in very top teams that make true teamwork quite much more difficult than at lower levels. And the nature of the way that teams at the top interact with each other versus the nature of what you expect from teams at a much lower level tends to be quite different. I mean, one of the factors will be the politics that goes on. Now, all leadership, all corporate leadership is a political game, but it's whether that politics is managed or is managed positively or managed negatively. But when politics spills down through the organization to lower level teams, you've got real problems, because lower level teams probably don't know how to deal with those politics and don't have the power and the influence to be able to resist the political pressures that are put on them. So there's lots of issues here around, at what level does this model actually work? And taking this to just staying with the performance bit a little bit more. What we did was for a big literature study where we tried to identify what are the factors that we would expect, or that the literature says actually influence performance in teams. And these headings cover virtually everything that we were able to find that was repeated multiple times. And so you clearly under purpose and goals, having goals that motivate, having a sense of direction and purpose, having everybody working towards the same goals, they're all factors that run underneath that. Under role clarity, well, the mission that we have is broken down into meaningful goals for everybody. There's a commitment to individual goals, commitment to collective goals. The performance focus too, there's one particular study that defines this as relatively more ambitious goals than the norm, which I quite like. It sort of captures it very easily. The skills issue, having a complementary skill set and interchangeable skills where necessary, and high levels of emotional intelligence seem to be part of this whole process as well. The task processes, how the team members are clear on how to work together and how they accomplish tasks. Do they have the authority to act and decide? The relationship processes, for example, how they defuse tension and friction, how they manage conflict. The decision making, how the team actually goes about making decisions. The trust issue, do people trust each other, and do they trust the team's purpose? Can they feel free to express feelings and ideas? The way they communicate too, how is it limited or is it extensive? The psychological safety thing or a whole issue is criticism constructive and oriented towards problem solving? Is there the kind of discussion that enables people to really point out issues and deal with those elephants in the room, and so forth? The collaborative process we would see that in high-performing teams as being unselfish, which is a term we'd hardly ever see in the management literature. The leadership processes, does the leadership of the team shift from time to time to drive results? No individual members are more important than the team. The conflict management, conflict is encouraged when it's constructive. The diversity issue, are we actually using diversity to its greatest benefit, or is it getting in the way? And the ownership, do people take responsibility for themselves and their tasks and their learning, as well as accountability for that of their colleagues? So all of these are the factors that came out from for the literature study that we did, and I see that other people have followed through and found pretty much the same results from their analysis of the literature. So if that's what we're looking for, this is rather complex. It's not that simple. You can't boil it. You can't just boil it down into simplistic statements. So what we basically then started to do was to see that these things were all intricately linked. That and from our analysis, we were able to identify that there were 5 primary things or areas which teams would tend to focus on, and any of those areas could be expressed positively or negatively. And the intervening factor that would help that, whether it was, or explain why they were expressed positive and negatively, was typically the role of the leader, the leader's qualities and behaviors, the LQBs. And if you look at these, the things in here, we won't go through all of them because there's so many of them, but you can see that the purpose and motivation is about what the team is there to do and the energy that the people in the team have to deal with things. But if that's great, well, when it works positively, it's great. But if the internal processes don't support that, then things would tend to disintegrate. So we've basically got each of these things has to interrelate with each of the others. The externally facing processes are fairly obvious. What we do, how you interrelate with your multiple stakeholders, and the reputation, how you manage your reputation, for example, in the external world, how you get access to resources such as information and finance, and then the relationships, how you work together, whether you enjoy each other's company, respect each other's ability, whether you can be honest towards each other. And then there's the internally facing processes. These are the internal quality things, approaches that you have, that how you manage the workflow, support each other, and maintain the quality of communication. And then the big one that seems to be common to all of these more modern models of team function and dysfunction, the learning, how the team adapts to its environment by continuously learning and applying that learning to better understanding and better management of what it does. And then the way that the leader works within this, the leader can either help the team do these things more effectively, or they can get in the way. One of the great team coaching exercises I love applying is getting with the leader's agreement, getting the team to define the kind of leadership they need, and then sitting down with the leader to work out not necessarily tell the leader this is what we want from you, but how they're going to support the leader in helping the leader to become the leader they need. This is quite fun. You have to have some confidence and a very good contract with them. So just looking at these things, the purpose and motivation, do they share the same narrative? Where do we get our energy from? These are two of the key questions we would ask. In terms of goal alignment, if we've got high alignment on the goals, what goals we want, and high alignment on how we're going to get there, then that's positive, that's great. But if we've got any other combination, we've got real problem. And if you've got low alignment on what you want and low alignment how you're going to do it, you've really got real conflict and you're going to have a low performing team. So we just understanding how the process of goal alignment, I think it's an important part for any team. The external processes of the team, how the team better understands and reacts to the expectations of stakeholders, and also the way that the social processes influence how they perceive and behave towards stakeholders and outsiders. I remember some studies a while ago of the language that people use about their customers. If you call your customers punters, for example, you probably are not. That implied lack of respect probably it can undermine the ethicality of your approach, of your way that you treat your customers quite substantially. So then the relationships too. We can ask, why is trust such a critical aspect of high performance, and how can team coaching build trust? So this is one of the things that we need to explore in our role as team coaches. We can also question how much collaboration between colleagues, teams you really need. Sometimes many teams actually don't need a great deal of interdependence. In which case, do they actually even need to operate as a team? Can they be more functionally effective as a group who happen to report to the same leader? If team members are going to take responsibility for each other, how are they going to become accountable for the well-being, development, and performance of each of their colleagues? When we've got individual performance rewards, for example, when we're measuring everybody on their individual performance, how does that affect the way that the team members behave collectively? And then the diversity issue. We know from various studies that diversity can either be a real drag on performance, or can be the creative spark that enables the team to be really innovative and cohesive. So how do we actually make the shift between one and the other? And then in terms of the internal process and systems, What's our team narrative? Does it enable us in some ways, or does it constrain us because it stops us thinking about other perspectives? Are we really open to change, or are we quite happy the way we are and ignoring the way the world is changing around us? The decision-making traps. The sunk cost trap is the obvious one that people put. We put so much effort in this, we've got to put a bit more effort in to make sure it succeeds, but it never does. And we see this happening in particularly in top teams time and time again. And we see that the way that teams make decisions, this comes from a Harvard Business Review study. They don't just correct the errors of their colleagues, they don't even correct them at all. They amplify the errors of colleagues typically. There's a cascade effect. So they follow the lead of the people who spoke first, or they take up more polarized positions than they had before they'd started having discussions. And most team meetings tend to focus on what everybody knows already, rather than inviting people who have different and conflicting information to take apart and actually prick the balloon. We understand this topic. So teams do make dumb decisions. Part of the role of a team coach is gently to help them understand just how dumb they are, without being patronizing, which could be quite difficult. I can say from experience. And the learning, what is it that helps and hinders learning within teams? How do we make sure the team has a genuine learning focus? Different types of team have different issues in terms of managing their learning. If you're a project team, you've got the issue that you may only be there for a short period of time, and you have very little time to embed the learning, for example. And similarly, the quality and quantity of the learning they experience, is it enough? How do we know that we're actually learning at the pace that we need to in order to simply tread water, let alone to advance and achieve the new and changing objectives that we will be faced with? And then the intervening variable, the leadership. How do teams get?
Hey, David, could I intrude real quick? Would you mind going back to the learning slide, just the previous slide?
We can.
And I wanted to just slow down for a second, because I know one of the things I've really appreciated about your book, Coaching the Team at Work, is you have almost like a third of the book is written on learning in teams and the idea of learning teams rather than performance teams. And I'd love for you to just pause, slow down a minute and just draw that out a little bit. I find that fascinating. Yeah. And part of it is, I think, we're kind of living in an age now in the VUCA world where it's hard for us to see too far out, right? And so learning agility, our ability to learn our way forward, is really, for me, becoming synonymous with performance. So I'd love for you to extrapolate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, we did this major study for the European Union where we looked at, the learning question was, how did teams manage their learning? And the assumption that was made when we bid for this work was that a team was a team was a team. But of course it's not. And there are teams which are stable in their membership and their tasks. There are teams which are stable in their membership and not in the task. And there are teams which are stable in the task but not in the membership. And you've got some teams which are unstable in both. And so in each of those cases, and a few other cases we identified, it was clear that there were different challenges to managing the learning. And so we found that teams had to develop norms that would enable learning to come to the fore as something that was important and on the agenda totally. And learning not just at the individual level, but the collective learning. And so it being much more objective and much more proactive in creating an environment where collective learning not only happened, but was seen to happen and was collected and stored. And so, one of the roles we identified was the team historian. And this could be a revolving, rotating role, different people taking up. But who captures the learning that a team is creating? Because people come and they go from teams. If you lose somebody who has all the knowledge, you've lost a vast asset. And so that's just one of the many issues that we identified with working with teams focused on the learning. And I think, and I'm fully with you, that learning and performance are two sides of the same kind. If you don't keep learning, your performance will decline. Okay, let's just get through the last few slides, and then we can have some discussion. And one of the big issues we saw within the leadership of teams is if the team leader is too weak. Sometimes the biggest problem of the team is the team leader. And a big question there is, should you even think about coaching a team where the leader is the main problem? If they're not prepared, particularly if they're not prepared to accept that they are the main problem. And then I'm working with some teams in the Far East at the moment, where there is no leader, formal leader. They're agile teams. Leadership rotates within that team. We're finding it quite fascinating to see, okay, how do that team make sure that it has the leadership when it needs it? And I wish I had a clear answer to that yet. We're going to be, some of our research will throw that up. But it does look as though everybody is able to slot in to a leadership role, and there are norms and expectations of how they will do that and how other people will defer to that and take over as necessary. But it requires some, I think, very, very different situations. And then sort of just rounding out on the leader, the secure leader, there was the work that we did here found that these secure leaders had all of these characteristics. The first thing was they didn't feel any need to control anybody. They actually saw themselves as enabling. They saw that you can't manage a large team. It's impossible. So they saw their role not as managing anybody, but it's supporting people in managing themselves. They expected the team to sort out the communications. They didn't need to know everything. They didn't want to be a post boy. They did take the role of helping the team or protecting the team from distractions from outside. Now that's something we've started to actually look at in a bit more depth just recently, because there's some suggestion that's a two-edged sword, because it's one thing to allow the team to get on with its work and say, well, actually, no, you don't worry about that. I'll keep the next layer of management off your backs, and I'll keep the finance department at bay, and I'll particularly keep HR at bay. But if you're doing that all the time, are you taking away the immune responses of the people within the team? And this is the question we're now starting to address. We don't know. It's just another bloody difficult question that we've originated. Certainly all this, that they make sure they spend a lot of their time, probably in some cases up to 50% of their time, making sure that everybody's aligned with the goals and understands their goals. They actually invite people to give them feedback. They've got this growth mindset that they and the team need to grow together. They also they care. There's this demonstration of just human caring and compassion is core to them. In some other work that we've done, we've been looking at the core characteristics of coaches and leaders, which seem to be the same things, and they turn out to be compassion, curiosity, and courage. And these guys have got these in great amounts. And I think this last statement here, they see themselves as a work in progress. I quite like that, being a work in progress. Being finished probably means you're dead. And I hate not to be a work in progress. So the outcome of all of this is that we help the team to have greater sustained capability so that they can continue to coach themselves effectively and to coach each other. So the coaching habit becomes something that's ingrained within the way within the culture of the team. And so the team too must take responsibility for helping the leader to build that collective coaching habit. And the role of the team coach in all of this is basically to be there as the support for both the team and its leader in developing this capability, so the team coach isn't needed anymore. The core role of a team coach ultimately, or the core measure of whether you've been successful as a team coach, is when the team has outgrown you and doesn't need you, when you become obsolete. So I'm going to stop at that point and hopefully throw it out for some discussion, some questions, some maybe some controversy with somebody that's disagreed with what I said.
That's great.
That'll be even better. But open to everybody. I haven't been able to follow the chat, but
yeah, I can help you with that, David. Could you go back to your framework where you have the grid of the PERIL framework?
Absolutely.
That might be helpful just as a summary slide to have in the background. So we had just a couple of questions in here, and one came from Sean Gallagher earlier, and let's see if I can find it, Sean. Let's see. It's going back pretty far in here. And Sean, feel free to jump on. Here it is. And feel free to jump on, Sean, if you want to give voice to this. But Sean mentioned, regarding the literature analysis of performance factors, what does Dr. Clutterbuck think about the work by Hackman and Wagaman on the 6 condition model? I believe Hackman and Wagaman have found their model accounts for up to 80% of the variance in team performance.
Absolutely. I think it's a very good model. It was primarily, again, based on top teams or very senior teams. And that's a question that we might have about it. But it's certainly something that was very informative. And some of the comments that I produced in my just brief description of what we found in the literature comes straight from Hackman and Wagaman. A very good, concise, and well-constructed piece of work.
Cool. We had a question from Angela here asking, if teams need to develop these capacities, how can we as coaches develop our fitness for purpose in this space? Winging it using existing skills from individual coaching, team facilitation building, etc., doesn't seem a good option.
Absolutely. I think that there's a balance here between knowing too much and knowing too little. If we come in and say, right, Mum, I'm the expert on internal processes. And I know all about total quality management and all this kind of stuff. It can get in the way, but it's actually really useful to have enough grounding in all of these areas to be able to know what questions to suggest to the team. And there's a really big difference between coming and saying, I'm the expert and I can help you solve this, and saying, actually, I have a strong understanding of what goes on in here and the way that these things interrelate. And that enables me to ask the kind of questions that will enable you as a team to have the conversation you need to have about this. I think it's also quite helpful to have a toolkit of simple diagnostics that you can use. Now, I'm not talking here about psychometrics because there are real issues with the overuse of psychometrics in team coaching. There are a number of team people who say they provide team coaching, for example, whose idea is that you give a team 6 sessions, and each session you have a different psychometric that you give them to begin with, and you base the whole session on that. That's not coaching. That's some kind of process consultancy.
Great. We had a question here from Todd around what are the key elements that distinguish team coaching from one-on-one coaching?
Oh, yes. Well, one of the things is how people make decisions. When you're working with an individual, you give them space and time to think things through. When they want to come to a solution on something, they'll come to it. You don't push them, at least not if you're a competent coach. When you're working with an entire team, you get the situation that some of the team have thought about this, and they come and jump straight and say, yes, now we understand this issue. We know what we want to do. Let's move on to the next issue. And half the team is saying, well, actually, no, we haven't. I'd really like to to think this through a lot more. I mean, we can stereotype this as extroverts versus introverts. It doesn't quite work that way, but it's a good enough stereotype. So what we have to do is have tools and techniques as a coach to be able to cope with that bifurcation in the team, the impatience of one group and the fears and the sense of being left behind of the other half. So you get all those internal dynamics within a team that make it much more difficult. And one of the reasons why we actually recommend that team coaching is done in pairs, so that you've always got somebody who's observing what's going on with the team, the dynamics of the team, at the same time, so that they can step in as needed, but also while you're actually managing the facilitation of the conversation, they're observing all those undercurrents that are going on. So that's one of the biggest issues. I think there also, if you're working in a team, there are things you would only want to talk about, things that were relevant to everybody. When we look at team meetings in many organizations, the leader of the team will go around the table having one-to-one conversations with each member of the team, boring everybody else to tears because they're not involved. We don't want to replicate that in team coaching. And also we've got the whole issue of what people are prepared to share. If somebody has significant fears about something, or things that or concerns which they don't wish the rest of the team to know, in one-to-one coaching we can just keep it within the relationship. Within team coaching, we've got to make sure that we don't actually tread into those areas. So we have to manage the boundaries very, very carefully.
Great. Well, the comments are coming in fast and furious here. So we have one from Robert who says, ICF says that group team coaching is 2 to 8 people max. Is that fair to say, max 8? Would you suggest a higher or lower number?
If you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, before I started researching with the high-tech company, I would have said that the literature on teams is unequivocal, that above 8 people, you start to get a deterioration in terms of effort because of social loafing. So, everybody assumes everybody else is going to do all the work. What we then discovered was that agile teams, actually, you can have teams of 60 or 70 people or more. And this really blew my mind to begin with. But then what we found was that what happened was that those teams had developed really good norms of communicating with each other. And the amount of time each of those teams spent communicating with other teams and building relationships with those other teams was phenomenal. And so if you think about roughly, what have you got, 8 teams, and if you've got 8 teams of 8 people, you actually multiplied it, but you've got a scale effect there. Now I think that's unusual. In general, the bigger the team, the more conflict you're likely to find in, or the more avoidance of conflict you will find within it. Sometimes as a team coach, we have to work with a team that's much bigger than that. And then one of the outcomes, I would say in at least 50% of the cases, is that the decision is made at some point that team has to be recast and shrunk in some way.
Great. So we have a question here from Janice who asks, curious to how your team coaching varies when part or all the team is virtual.
It's very difficult. There is no simple answer to making it work well, but as well as everybody being there, because one of the things the interaction between people, the non-verbal communication between people is much truncated if they're virtual, particularly if it's sound only. So you have to. What we've learned is that one of the ways to do this is to actually keep the interventions shorter and more focused, and that helps a bit. But we don't really have a strong way of dealing with this yet. However, I am informed that the technology will very shortly exist for the team to come together as holograms in a virtual environment. Once we can do that, then we may be able to much better replicate the face-to-face environment.
Yeah. I think Microsoft HoloLens, there's some pretty cool videos you can Google on YouTube for what's coming around augmented reality. But on this thing of I do a lot of work with teams that are virtual, and we may do a kickoff face-to-face. But one of my best team coaching engagements, we did 1-hour calls every week for 12 weeks over a 16-week period, just using teleconference. The team was dispersed, but we had a really structured coaching session of how we did the coaching calls. And I think it was about the frequency of the calls. They were only an hour long, and we had a way of doing it that it actually worked really well. So I've actually found, whether it's face-to-face, on the phone, using video like Zoom, it's just, these are all tools, and it's how we use them, right?
Yeah, so it's that brevity and structure. that exactly is the two things that make it work.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. We had another question here by AC. Let me see if I can find it. Can you expand on the notion of trust? I have witnessed the knowledge hoarding.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, well, people hoard knowledge because they're afraid, and they're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of being supplanted. I don't know if anybody gets the Dilbert cartoons, but the Dilbert cartoon is one of the people in the one that came out today was about being mentored. And nobody will mentor this guy because they're afraid of if they give him any knowledge that he'll take their jobs. And so I think that's the epitome of this of an environment with lack of trust. Lencioni's work on build on trust, I think is very useful and good. He's looked at it in some depth, but it's trust and rapport, I think, because you can trust somebody but not necessarily have that degree of openness with them that comes from true rapport. So when you've got rapport, you've got trust, you've got you've got a number of other factors which include a sense of shared objectives. So you're both working towards the same thing. You've got confidentiality. So I mean, you can confident that you know that what you say to that person will not be misused in any way. So you might trust them in terms of reliability to do things, but you might not trust them in terms of will they keep their mouth shut about things. Then there's the whole issue of trust of empowerment. Do you actually feel that this relationship is one which is liberating for you, or do you feel it's one that confines you? I think one of the most frightening things anybody ever said to me as a mentor was that somebody wanted to be just like me, and apart from judging doubting their sanity, you could not have built true rapport with somebody in that situation.
Cool. So we had another good question up here earlier, and Zachary asked, in team coaching, do you find yourself most often coaching towards relationships, systems, or something else?
The answer, it could be anything else. I think there are certain recurrent problems like conflict or a weak manager or simple lack of resources, which you get to recognize time and time again. Another one would be simply not the way that the team, too many meetings that the team might have, for example. Teams that care too much about one thing but not enough about another. So there's lots of recurrent themes. So I don't think there's any one thing that I would say would come out as being common to every single intervention we would undertake. But I'm sure many of the other team coaches on the call will have their own views around that.
Great. Marita asked a really good question here around, can you expand on how you handle an obvious weak leader?
Yes. Apart from putting him in a quiet office and giving him a loaded pistol, I think which is I don't think it's allowed anymore. But I think the critical thing is what kind of a weak leader is this? And some interesting research into plateaued managers some years ago, 25 years ago or more ago, threw some sidelights on this. And what it found was that managers who were plateaued were effective or ineffective according to whether they were inner directed or outer directed in their mindset. So if you have somebody, whether it's a plateau manager or we're extrapolating this now to weak leaders, if the weak leader it has a mindset, that it's everybody else's fault, it's all it's other people's responsibility. When my own boss goes and who doesn't recognize how wonderful I am, or when I get a new team who realize how clever I am, then everything will be all right. But this shift is an inability to accept accountability for your own actions and your own responsibility for making things better for yourself and others. then you're not going to be able to have much progress with that person. The best you can do is to have a quiet word with HR and say, look, you've got a problem here. If the person, on the other hand, is inner directed, so instead of being outer directed as the previous one, so if they're inner directed, they see the solution to their own problems being within themselves, and they have a learning orientation, but they're just not very experienced. Then that person has great capability, and it's about helping them and their team and other stakeholders to contract to say, okay, how do we collectively help this person become a really effective leader for this team and from what it wants to achieve? And when we do that, we find that this typically delivers quite a lot of results. If you can do this within the context of a team development plan, where you, where you integrate individual learning plans, development plans, with that to make so you've got a collective development plan that incorporates individual and team development, and where the line manager shares their development needs and engages the team and other people in it, you've got a really powerful engine there.
Awesome. So we've just got about 5 minutes to the formal time left here, and I want to get a couple more questions. And I apologize if I haven't kept up with the flurry here for everyone, if you didn't get your question answered. Robert has a good one here. You mentioned too much structure and too large a focus on psychometrics miss the client-centered point of coaching. What's the right proportional or stages here? Is it a quarter session can be used with structured tools? The first session needs to be an info primer, and then team-directed coaching, psychometrics every 3 to 6 months. But I guess there's some sense here of what's the right balance between using structure and psychometrics versus other areas of focus. Yeah.
And I think everybody will have a slightly different view on this. My own personal view, and I'm emphasizing it's my view, and it's what I prefer to do, is to focus first on interviewing everybody in the team. So try to understand the team narrative, because any questionnaire is only going to tell you what's asked in the questionnaire. What I really want to understand up front is, what drives this team? How cohesive is it? How do people see themselves and each other within the team? And I can ask questions like, if you were putting this team together from scratch, would you choose to have all the same people in it? That's a pretty revealing question. And so getting this narrative first, then you can start thinking about what psychometric would most help the team at this, if any, at this stage. In general, and I think this is true for one-to-one coaching and team coaching, people tend to be psychometric out. They've had so many of these things. And so when we do any kind of diagnostic, it should be in response to an issue that's identified by the team and a willingness by the team or a desire by the team to investigate that particular area. So what you're doing is saying, okay, so you've identified that there's that there is potentially a lack of psychological safety in this team. As it happens, I have in my toolbox a nice psychological safety questionnaire, which perhaps you might like to complete. And rather than me do this for you, perhaps one of you would like to take responsibility for managing this. So we're giving the responsibility back to the team. So it's responding to needs as they arise, rather than assuming there is one generic way of doing it. Now that said, I know there are certain people who like to do Hogan or something like that up front. If that's the way that you like to, that's fine. But of course, if you do it at that point, you can't do it to respond to a need within the team later.
David, you mentioned something around interviewing before the team coaching proceeds. Best case scenario, is there both individual coaching with each person and team coaching happen concurrently, or is it that you do the individual coaching first as a precursor to get that interview data, and then it becomes a team coaching thing?
Well, I wouldn't be formally coaching them in the original interviews. I would interview.
Okay, sure. Right.
Yeah. Now, but you've raised an interesting issue, which there is no clear answer to. Is should the same team coach everybody individually and the team as well as collectively? Yeah. And I think we see different views on this. Personally, I think it can work in some circumstances to coach everybody. and not in others. So I would want to take a view on that, having got to know the team a bit.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. So David, we are right here at the hour now, and if you have time to linger around a little bit, love to stick around, but I want to kind of start to bring the formal part of this session to a close, and want to thank everybody for coming. I think, these sessions, the time just blows by. There's some like fast and furious comments, and I hope you take away one or two ideas from this session. And I'm actually going to leave you with a question, David, here at the end. But just before that, I want to thank ATD New York City, ICF New York City for co-hosting this session today with David and the Team Coaching Zone. We're actually going to be, the Team Coaching Zone is going to be bringing David over. Angela Wright and I are working on this in June for a 3-day masterclass in New York City. So I will put a link to that in the chat window if you guys want to check that out. We're trying to, as we discover people through podcasts and these webinars and things, we're trying to curate learning experiences. And I think learning with David is a great opportunity. So if you're interested in that, you've got that link there. Also, a bunch of the names that have popped up in the chat window, there are podcasts available. I stuck a link to that in the chat window along with David. Highly recommend you do that. I remember asking David on the podcast around, what do you do when teams are just really broken and really dysfunctional? Because I think a lot of times we as team coaches get called in when it's sort of a Hail Mary situation where, you're being asked to do some miracle work. And I've definitely found myself in those and, starting to get better at not stepping into those when they're kind of no-win situations. And maybe the best you can do there is just help a team get a soft landing. But David, you wrote this great book in 2007. It's on my bookshelf, Coaching the Team at Work. I'm curious for you. You've been a seminal figure in coaching and mentoring. You've seen sort of the evolution of the coaching field. What are your thoughts about the trend towards team coaching? I mean, we're seeing a big ramp up to that now. I think you were kind of 10 years ahead of the curve when you wrote your book. But I'm curious, just as a closing comment for you to maybe just talk a little bit from your experience and vantage point around what are you noticing around the uptake of team coaching, the future of it? I loved your storytelling there about working with a .com where you were seeing really large teams working in, distributed ways around Agile and distributing leadership. Any thoughts about the arc of team coaching as you've seen it over your career?
I'm not quite sure. I heard the last bit, but I'm sure. Just where is it going? Is what you're saying? Yep. Yeah,
I guess where it's come from and where it's going.
Okay, so I think it's come from an unevidenced mess of lots of people calling things team coaching which aren't, and we're now and although that's still there, we actually there's a lot of people who really taken team coaching seriously and have gone through some training or have read up and have practiced and reflected on what they do as a team coach. We've recently done some research on supervision of team coaches, and that's a bit of a Wild West, but again, it's beginning to professionalize. So I think the professionalization of team coaching is a big trend that we're seeing. The other thing that I'm seeing is that whereas a few years ago we had very few internal team coaches in corporations, it's now being seen by many corporations, or some corporations around the world, as an important next step for their internal cohorts of coaches. And one of the things that happens is that the internal coaches get bored. They need further development, but they don't want to take more and more coaching courses, and they can't do thousands of hours because they've got a real job to do. And so training them as team coaches seems to be a significant and growing trend, certainly that we're observing in Europe.
Yeah, just echoing that, Dave, one of the things I'm starting to see both in my podcasting and some of the work I've been doing is group coaching alongside of team coaching. Yes. And, embedding group coaching within team coaching, but, seeing this sort of shift to economies of scale that you can get in group coaching and in team coaching. And I had Richard Boyatzis on my podcast. I think he spoke about, group coaching and what he called peer group coaching as being the new modal form of learning that's probably going to, take over learning and development and leadership development in the future. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the rise of group coaching, which we hear about more.
Absolutely.
As well.
I think in my supervision of team coaches in the last 3 weeks, it's probably come up 4 or 5 times that the coaches say, how much of what I do as a team coach can I apply to group coaching or some variation of that? So it's clearly a current topic and a trend. And I think it's great. The other thing that we're seeing is group or team mentoring. So professional mentors going through the same processes. In Poland, there's a whole program that recently been launched specifically for that. So lots of change and evolution, which is great.
David, there's a bunch coming up in the chat window around supervision, and I know among some of us, those of us who are in North America, we comment that our supervision culture here isn't as strong as it is in Europe. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about supervision, team coaching supervision, etc.
I think what we're getting from the comments we're getting from people around the world, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, Hong Kong, and across Europe, very much that people who use one-to-one supervision really find that having a team coach that even if they use team one-to-one supervision just periodically, when they become team coaches, they recognize the value of it and they use team coaching much more rigorously. And it's because it's much lonelier out there in front of a whole bunch of people than it is just one-to-one with somebody. You can really feel isolated and threatened when the only thing that's united the team is their hatred of you.
I love that. When the team actually starts hating you is when you actually know you're doing good work.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Usually they're ready to take their authority back. Really good stuff here. So good stuff. I know, again, we could probably keep going on here, and I don't know if there's any burning questions. If anybody had a burning question that didn't get asked and wants to get it in now, if David's still available for a few more minutes, we can pop that in. Otherwise, we can start to bring this session to a close. Again, I'll be sending everybody who registered for the webinar today a link to a replay recording of this session. There's some suggestions around podcasts and resources for team coaching supervision. So we'll kind of give you a list of different folks out in the field that I know of that are doing that kind of work. David, is it okay if we share the slides with the participants?
Absolutely.
As well?
Yeah.
So I'll include that in the email so you'll get a copy of the slides. And again, if folks are interested and want to join us in New York, we are going to have David coming over in early June. I put a link to that in the slides as well. And really great stuff. So I don't think we have any new final questions getting in here. And I think that's pretty much it. So David, I'll give you the final word. But again, thank you for taking your time out in your evening there in the UK for joining us and sharing with us about the PERIL model, which was new to me. Really enjoyed learning about that and the great comments from the participants. And it was a fun, rich session. So over to you for the final word, and then we'll say goodbye.
What more can I say than that? I hope to see as many as possible of you in New York while we're there. We can have a little bit more fun, and maybe then I can. I don't know. Did we say that one of my hobbies is stand-up comedy?
Yeah. Well, we'll take you. We'll hold your feet to the fire and some accountability on that for good coaching for a comedy routine in New York City.
Yeah. But thank you everybody for participating with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day or evening wherever you are.
Thank you.
Ciao
Bye
then.
now. Bye.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, David.
Cheers.